Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about PTSD and how we can more accurately recognize and understand it. In order to do this, we first have to ask, what is PTSD? PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is defined by the Mayo Clinic as a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event, either experiencing it or witnessing it. This could be anything from combat, the most well-known event that people think of when they picture PTSD, being robbed, and natural disasters, or any major change that scares someone. Now, this doesn't mean that every big change someone makes will cause PTSD, but it does mean that some things can be traumatic that you may not have thought of. It's a shock to the system either way. This is part of the reason why, when this disorder was first being analyzed, it was called shell shock. Soldiers in World War I suffered from PTSD symptoms such as insomnia, flashbacks, fatigue, impaired vision, tremors, and confusion. At that time, the illness was seen as more physical due to soldiers becoming unable to return to the field from their symptoms. More on that in a minute. My main goal for today is to explain why PTSD needs to be more accurately recognized and understood today. There's still a serious stigma around PTSD, and even stereotypes for what constitutes the disorder. So let's get into it. So we've come a long way in knowing what PTSD is, but there's still a prevalent stigma around the stress disorder because most people assume you have to be a combat-exposed soldier to have PTSD. As stated earlier, however, PTSD can be caused by any traumatic event. This isn't to say that combat soldiers don't ever have PTSD, but they aren't the only people who can develop the disorder, and combat certainly isn't the only factor. I mentioned some of these before, but natural disasters, any form of assault, being robbed, a car accident, the death of a loved one, a medical scare, these can all make someone develop symptoms of PTSD. Part of the assumptions about PTSD stem from the media as well, especially movies and shows. While plenty of movies often portray PTSD accurately, the scope of trauma that is seen most often is military combat survivors. Again, while military combat is a cause, it isn't the only cause. TV shows and movies don't often show how natural disasters, robberies, or even childhood trauma could affect someone. There's also the issue of how PTSD is portrayed, as some features are occasionally over-dramatized for entertainment, or even under-dramatized. While the severity of symptoms affects individuals differently, it should be kept in mind that what happens on screen will never compare to what might be happening in someone else's actual life. Something that also greatly affects our view of PTSD is the history of it. In 1915, World War I was in full swing, and young men across the world were facing combat, death, and danger every day. This was especially true of bombshells, which were dropped on both sides multiple times and led to many injuries and deaths. It also led to uninjured survivors of the blast to suffer from a form of shock, with symptoms such as reduced field of vision, memory loss, tremors, and even loss of smell and taste. The term shell shock was coined because of the bombshell explosion associated with the illness. Early medical opinions on these cases led to shock being caused by the concussive motion of the blasts, rather than something non-physical. However, by 1916, the symptoms of tremors, memory loss, ringing in the ears, confusion, insomnia, and poor concentration were observed in soldiers that had not experienced any sort of explosive trauma. This led to shell shock being split into two categories, physical and emotional. The emotional side of this would eventually come to be known as the modern-day diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Before this change, however, treatments of the past were given in the hope of curing the patients and were often not exactly sound in today's terms. They included shock therapy, electric heat baths, hypnosis, and forcing frozen or tense limbs to move. However, as shell shock began to become a primary affliction of the war, treatments became more sympathetic and included rest and rehabilitation therapies, as well as occasional psychotherapy sessions. Today, studies of the split between the physical shell shock and emotional shell shock have been theorized to be the modern-day equivalent of PTSD and a traumatic brain injury, or TBI. In some TBI cases, soldiers were unaware that they had sustained brain injuries, but experienced similar symptoms to someone with PTSD. Treatments of today also take a much more sympathetic approach, as psychotherapy and support groups are most commonly used now. There is, again, a lot of history and research pertaining to military PTSD cases, but other cases are looked down upon because of this belief that only something as life-altering as war can cause PTSD and its symptoms. victims of sexual assault, witnesses to violence, children who have experienced neglect, victims of terrorism, people who have suffered traumatic medical injuries, people who have suffered near-death experiences, and many, many other people who have gone through other life-altering, terrifying events should not be pushed aside just because they experienced something different from a war veteran. These are still victims, and they're still dealing with this disorder. These people are just as valid in seeking help or in experiencing their symptoms and pain. That's why down below I've provided links for resources to help you or someone you may know who may have PTSD. Your trauma, your struggles, are just as important as anyone else's. If you need help, please check out the links below. You do not have to suffer in silence.